This is one of those moments in history when things come together like a jigsaw to produce something entirely new. Look at the bits we've got so far. Because of the linen, we have cheap paper. The Black Death is just over, so the economy of Europe is on the up and up. Administration is expanding. There are many more clerks needed to do all the paperwork. However, the Black Death has killed half the clerks off, so they cost a great deal. So we have extremely cheap paper, and the cost of a man who writes on it has gone up astronomically. What do you need to solve that problem? Yes, printing. And that's exactly what happened. But before the final bit of the jigsaw could be put into place, you needed one particular skill, the kind of skill, say, a goldsmith has. If you come upstairs with me, I'll show you what I mean. You see, printing had been around for centuries, in the case of the Chinese for 1,000 years, but it was printing with blocks like this. The trouble was those blocks, being made of wood, would tend to wear down, and in any case they only did the one thing. Now what our goldsmith friend did, and by the way his name was Johann Gutenberg and he lived in Mainz in Germany in the 1450s, he used his expertise with precious metal. He knew what that was, the hallmark, and he knew that the hallmark was made with a punch. So he took a punch and he carved a letter on the end of it, and using the punch he punched that letter into a soft copper bar. Then he designed a mold in 2 bits so that it comes apart. You put the mold together like that. You slide into the mold the letter you want to make, any letter. Close it tight with a big spring. Turn it over. And then very, very carefully you put molten lead alloy into the mold like this. Leave it for just a few seconds, and then you break the mold, and the letter is there, ready to print with. And that letter A will go anywhere on the page you want to put a letter A. It will go in the place of any other letter A. The mold makes all the letters so they're all the same size. It makes all the spaces so they're all the same size. So the printing is uniform. But it's the interchangeability of the letters that is at the heart of Gutenberg's invention. If you think about it, it was a good deal easier for a European to do than, say, for a Chinese, because the Chinese language has thousands of characters, and if you made every one of them, you'd need a space as big as this printing room in Antwerp just to store them in. Whereas the Latin alphabet of the time only had 23 letters to be made. As for the printing itself, well, that was a bit of a cinch. This press was just an adaptation of a linen press that had been around for centuries, as had the ink and the paper. This is the first dated piece of printing we know of. There may be earlier ones, but this one has a date on it. And the people who did it were very proud of what they'd done. It's the introduction to a book of Psalms. And the text says, "This work, adorned with the magnificence of capital letters, was fashioned with the use of a mechanical process for printing and making letters without the use of a pen." And then it says the name of the 2 men who were so proud of what they'd done, Joachim Furst and Peter Schoeffer. And then the date, 14th of August, 1457. The coming of the book changed everything. Perhaps the most obvious change was the appearance of the bookshop, where you could come in and buy anything you wanted to read. Knowledge was no longer the private property of the priest or the prince or the scholar. If you could pay and you could read, it was all yours. The new books also standardized spelling. They carried an author's name, and they encouraged accuracy because the books could be widely read by people who knew more about the subject perhaps than the author himself. But perhaps most fundamental of all, the new books gave birth to the specialization that is the blessing or the bane, depending on your point of view, of our modern world. Because you see, the architects and the engineers started to write about what they knew in terms that only their co-professionals would understand. The generation that first read these new books could as easily turn its hand to the lute or the sword or the architect's drawing. And because of printing, they were the last generation to be able to do that. The coming of the books must have seemed as if it was going to turn the world upside down in the way it spread and democratized knowledge. And one of the few men responsible for that spread was an Italian called Aldus Manutius. And he realized that what people needed and wanted was cheap, standard books that they could carry with them anywhere they went in their saddlebags. And so he produced the world's first pocket edition. And he did so in what by 1500 was the printing capital of Europe, Venice. Used to blow their own trumpet a lot, the 16th century Venetians. Well, you couldn't blame them. There were, after all, more millionaires per square inch here than anywhere else in Europe. Biggest navy, biggest overseas commercial empire, biggest bank balance. Venice was queen of the seas. Of course, there was nowhere else she could have been queen of. Not much land in Venice. She was a city full of businessmen. And because of her connections with Constantinople, she was also full of Greeks, refugees from when the Turks invaded it in 1453. And it was the Greek connection that gave the printer Aldus Manutius his big chance. Because Aldus got the Greek refugees to work for him, and because of that, his books gave the world a taste for the knowledge and the style of ancient Greece. He turned out dictionaries and grammar books first, so his customers could learn Greek, and then, of course, they could move on to reading the Greek books he would sell them. No fool he. Well, the new books got everybody turned on to matters ancient. One of the earliest bestsellers was a Roman thing on architecture that got people into big prestige building projects, people like Michelangelo. Thanks to Aldus and the Venetian printing presses, in 1500, only 50 years after Gutenberg, there were no less than 20 million books in existence. In 1515, Aldus died. Aldus Manutius was laid to rest with his books heaped around him as a mark of respect for what he'd done, which was to print every major Greek classic in existence and invent a new kind of letter type for his pocket editions. It was a kind of print that would pack a lot into a tight space. We call it italic. So now the world could start worrying about something it had never had to worry about before: the small print. But above all, thanks to books, the world learnt about Greek science. This was one of the books that made the greatest impact of all, by the Greek hero of Alexandria. It details how to make machines using the natural forces of air, or steam, or water as power sources. It's really talking about complicated toys. But this book and others like it put the world of Greek science and the ancient past into the hands of the armourers and the architects and the engineers working for the princes and bishops of 16th century Italy. And look how the armourers immediately begin to work in the antique style. On this tapestry, this bunch of soldiers, they're using the latest in handguns, and yet they themselves are dressed like Caesar's centurions. As the wealth of the mysterious East and West began to pour into Europe and the population began to soar, the princes also began to embellish their growing cities with elaborate water supply systems, operated by the same mechanical devices as were shown in the Greek and Roman books. And in their homes, the aristocrats would hang tapestries like this one, containing scenes of fantastic inventions like the flying throne, being carried into the sky by winged beasts that can never quite make the piece of ham above their heads. Or the mythical story of Alexander the Great, exploring the oceans on board a submarine. What the princes wanted were things, toys, that would show off their wealth and position in a way that would amuse and impress their friends. And now their armourers and their engineers had the techniques to do it. One of the most famous armourers of the time, a fellow called Bartholomew Campi, switched, for example, from making this rather complex armour, a gauntlet, to making things like this. It's a clockwork tortoise carrying the god Poseidon, and it was used at the dinner table because they would set it down and it would take toothpicks from one guest to another around the table. The vogue for automatic machines spread everywhere, and with the help of the hydraulic engineers, it spread in a form that would bring people hundreds of miles just to take a look. This is one of the best ones still working, the Castle of Hellbrunn outside Salzburg, built in 1615 so the Prince Archbishop and his guests could have a little water-powered fun and games. The whole place works on water turbines running the familiar cylinder with pegs in it, operating a 16th century Disneyland. The name of the game was to get the most unexpected things to spurt water all over the suckers who come to dinner. Everybody laughed, ha-ha, because the host was a prince. And besides, you got a free meal out of it all. Well, that's not all you got out of it. Of course, ha-ha, you couldn't get up until the prince did, and of course, ha-ha, he didn't need to. The craze for automatic machinery that spread through Europe came here too, of course. Here, the pegged cylinders run an entire village of mechanical puppets, working like the carillon in Belgium did on wires and levers. The whole thing's only 18 feet wide, and they packed 113 little people into that space. Over the top of all this water-powered wizardry, there was a mechanical organ to drown the machinery noise. And as you left, the prince would politely raise his hat. Mechanical organs and things might have stayed just that if it hadn't been for another craze sweeping Europe, a mania for Chinese fashions, particularly in dress, when, at the beginning of the 18th century, very complicated patterns became all the rage, especially in France, and particularly in silk.